All of this goes back to the extinct forms and brings us up into the extant forms, the ones still alive. In all those diagrams I showed you, I think you could see that at the top of the page, there were the modern forms. And we have sequences going back, all of which is what we would predict if indeed evolution had proceeded by natural selection and the creation of new species and then the accumulation of new species from them and new species from them, giving you this tremendous, wonderful diversity, all of it consistent with the notion of natural selection. And very difficult, I would say, as I've already said, to account for it as having all been essentially created at one time. If we turn to extant forms, there's one item here that, again, Luther Sunderland just refused to treat. And I'm bringing it up and hoping we'll get a different response today. If you look at living forms and look at the structure of populations and look at the difference between populations, we would predict that we should see some forms that are just beginning to separate one population from another, others that will be much further separated, and others yet further along. What would we expect to see? That is the general prediction. Well, if the populations that are still trying to interbreed are not so different that they can't interbreed, but so different that when they do interbreed, the genes from one do not effectively interact with the genes from other, the hybrids that will be produced will be weak, will be sterile, will perhaps not even develop at all. And all of these are seen. Darwin was aware of these hybrids, but because of his lack of understanding of genetics, because he did not define species in terms of reproductively isolated population, he did not really understand hybridism, even though he devoted a whole chapter to it in The Origin of Species. Today we refer to these differences as indeed isolating mechanisms, genetic mechanisms, genetic differences which inhibit or block mating. Hybrid disadvantage can result in hybrid breakdown, namely you will get hybrids formed, but then they do not in turn produce vigorous offspring. Or you will get hybrid sterility, as when a donkey and a horse mate and you get a mule that is vigorous, but it is sterile. Or you can get forms such as extremes of the population of the grass frog. The grass frog in Maine will mate with the grass frog in Florida, but the eggs will simply not develop. All of that is hybrid disadvantage. The next step is gamete isolation, where yes, members of different species will try and mate, but the gametes never fuse. There is no hybrid form. There is no fertilized egg. You can have physiological isolation where, for example, the pollen from one plant will land in the stigma of another plant, and then as the pollen tube tries to grow down to achieve fertilization, there is something incompatible in the surrounding tissues, and the pollen tube stops growing. Or male sperm can be deposited in the reproductive tract of the female, but the sperm never migrate up the reproductive tract to fertilize the egg. There's something incompatible in the environment. And that's physiological isolation, resulting in the gametes never getting together and achieving fertilization. There is this curious phrase of mechanical isolation. This is referring, for example, to where indeed insects, the genitalia on the female and the male are so different that even though they may try to copulate, there is no effective deposition of sperm into the female oviducts. And the mechanical differences in the genitalia exclude this transfer of genetic material and the gametic isolation. And then finally, you run into mate isolation. There are behavioral barriers where indeed you do not get the behavior of one mate signaling the appropriate response in the other mate, where you get seasonal barriers where one comes into mating willingness, say in early spring, and another different population of frogs in late spring. And indeed, we find the green frogs mating at one time, the peepers at another time, and the bullfrogs at yet another time. There is then this sequence of forms here showing degrees of separation until we get complete reproductive isolation. I would love to see an explanation of the creationists for that sort of difference there. Were these really created with just those differences and have been that way for 10,000 years or more? We have then overall diagrams such as this, where we have the time going from the origin of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. There might have been an early chemical evolution here. If we were debating the origin of life, this is where we would have to talk about it, and we have very little evidence on it. No biologist has created life in a test tube. We're still trying to do it. Then we have the simpler cells that emerge first, the more complicated cells, and then the multicellular system. If we ever found a human skull down in here, or indeed even found over here the pollen of a redwood tree, this would indeed be a kind of disproof. We would have to re-examine, totally reconstruct. It is very easy to consider potentially falsifying statements. The point is we have not yet found them. I end up then with the point that we have a problem with the creationist point of view. As compared to the model of change that we have with evolution, natural selection bringing about different changes of adaptive genes, what is the creation process that occurred? We don't know. We need to have some specific model so that we can say, if that is the creation process, then we would expect this. In the evolution model, if you have these changes in genes, then you should accumulate successive changes of genes. And you will then get this gradual separation and isolation. And we have lots of evidences of that. That kind of thing does happen. So that we end up, in support of my original contention, the creationists do not have a specific model. They have problems with predictions. The one prediction that everything came about at the same time is simply not supported by the fossil evidence. What we do find in the fossil evidence and extant forms is consistent with the theory of evolution. I would say then there is no effective science because there is no testing of ideas. There are no potentially falsifying statements on the creationist side, and we have abundant evidence that those are there, and evolution has passed those tests. Thank you.